Assalamu alaikum students. Hope you are doing well. Today we are going to discuss a very important topic, that is cerebral cortex. We will discuss the functions of cerebral cortex, what are the different lobes of cerebral cortex, and what is the cytoarchitecture of the cerebrum. So by the end of today's session, inshallah, you will be able to enumerate the different layers of cerebrum, the 6 layers of cerebral cortex. We will discuss each of them. Then we will discuss the role of different association areas of the cerebrum. We have discussed some of the sensory cortex areas and some of the motor cortex area, but there are some other association areas as well, and we will try to cover the functions of each of these association areas. And at the end of today's lecture, we will discuss a very important clinical condition, that is aphasia. So these are the learning outcomes for the today's session. So let's begin. So as far as the cerebrum is concerned, also known as the cerebral cortex or pallium, it contains billions of neurons, and we can divide the cerebrum into two main segments on the basis of its evolutionary stages. As far as the phylogenetical development or embryological development is concerned, we can classify cerebrum into two major segments. The first one is the neocortex, which is the latest part to develop, neocortex, and there are 6 layers in the neocortex. Neocortex is also known as isocortex or homogenetic cortex. The other segment, or the other component rather, of the cerebrum is the allocortex, which contains only the 3 layers, and the subdivisions of allocortex include archicortex and paleocortex. So this is the phylogenetical classification of the cerebrum. By phylogenesis, we mean on the basis of evolutionary stages or embryological development, where archae is the oldest to develop, paleo is the next stage of development, and neocortex is the latest of all. Neo means new. So these are the two main components of cerebrum. So we can divide the cerebrum into multiple lobes. Each cerebrum is connected with the opposite one with the help of corpus callosum, and each segment, each portion is known as the cerebral hemisphere. And within each cerebral hemisphere, there are multiple lobes. The first one is the frontal lobe. The anterior most lobe is the frontal lobe. Posterior to frontal lobe is the parietal lobe. Inferior to parietal lobe is the temporal lobe. And the posterior most lobe is the occipital lobe. So each lobe within each cerebral hemisphere has specific functions. We have discussed some of the functions already. For example, frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere is involved in the voluntary control of the skeletal muscles. Moreover, this lobe is responsible for the higher intellectual functions. For example, planning of voluntary movement, programming of voluntary movement, and verbal communication. Then comes the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is responsible for the somatosensitive interpretation. And there are different functions. For example, understanding of speech is one of them. Formulating words to express thoughts and emotions is yet another function of parietal lobe. Inferior to the parietal lobe is the temporal lobe. Now this is very important for the auditory sensations as well as for visual sensations. So the input is received from both the auditory cortex and the visual cortex. But the primary function of the temporal lobe is interpretation of the auditory input, whereas the occipital lobe is responsible for the interpretation of the visual input. So these are the four major lobes of each cerebral hemisphere: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobe. Here you can see all the four lobes. You are viewing the lateral surface of the left cerebral hemisphere. Why we can say that this is the left cerebral hemisphere? Because of this temporal lobe. So mind you, temporal lobe is the hallmark, or you can say the indicator for the side determination. It is always projecting anteriorly. So this is the temporal lobe. This means this should be the frontal lobe, and the opposite posterior end is the occipital lobe. In between is the parietal lobe. This whole lobe, whole region superior to the temporal lobe, and in between frontal and occipital is the parietal region. So frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. These are the four major lobes within each cerebral hemisphere. You can see multiple numbers labeled on the surface of the cerebral cortex: 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 4, 6. And these numbers are placed according to the Brodmann's classification, named after the German scientist Corbinian Brodmann. And this gentleman was responsible for classifying the surface of the cerebrum on the basis of its cytoarchitecture. Remember, these cerebral areas are labeled according to the histological features, that is, according to the cytoarchitecture. And there are multiple fissures, grooves, and gyri over the surface of the cerebral cortex. The indentations are the sulci, and the elevations are the gyri. The grooves, the indentations are the sulci, and the elevated portions between the sulci are gyri. And the major sulcus which runs vertically over the lateral surface of the cerebral cortex is the central sulcus of Rolando. As you can see, I am pointing towards the lat lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and you can see this sulcus which runs vertically downwards towards the temporal lobe. This is the central sulcus of Rolando, and all the portion of the cerebrum which is posterior to this central sulcus is the sensory portion. As you can see, this dotted line is the line of demarcation. This line of demarcation separates the posterior sensory portion from the anterior motor cortex. This means the gyrus posterior to the central sulcus of Rolando is the sensory cortex, area 3 to 1, and the complete name is somatosensory area or somatosensory area 1. According to the Brodmann's classification, the somatosensory area 1 is labeled as area 3 to 1. And the gyrus posterior to this primary somatosensory area 1 is the somatosensory association area, area 5 and 7. So these are the sensory cortex. And the gyrus anterior to the central sulcus is the motor cortex. The immediate gyrus, immediate to the central sulcus placed anteriorly is the primary motor cortex. And according to the Brodmann's classification, this has been labeled as area 4. And anterior to the primary motor cortex is the supplementary motor cortex and premotor cortex. So both premotor cortex as well as supplementary motor cortex, both are labeled according to the Brodmann's classification as area 6. So area 321 somatosensory area and area 5-7 somatosensory association area are the sensory cortex. Similarly, primary motor cortex, that is area 4, premotor cortex and supplementary motor cortex, that is area 6, all are the motor areas. So remember the line of demarcation, the central sulcus which runs over the lateral surface of the cerebrum, it runs vertically downwards towards the temporal lobe and separates the posterior sensory cortex from the anterior motor cortex. So today we will discuss the important functions of some of the motor areas. We will start from the primary motor cortex, area 4. And as we have discussed, this is classified as Brodmann's area 4. And this is the region responsible for the control of voluntary movements of the limbs, especially the distal segments of the limbs, particularly movements of hands, movements of fingers. All these voluntary discrete movements are controlled by this Brodmann's area 4 or primary motor cortex. Another important thing to remember is that whenever you stimulate this area, stimulation of area 4 will mostly cause contraction of a group of muscles. So rather contraction of a single muscle, you will observe contraction of muscles as a group. This means this area is controlling all the voluntary movements of the muscles as a whole. So we can deduce that excitation of a single motor cortex neuron will usually excite a specific movement rather than one specific muscle. So to conclude, primary motor cortex is responsible for the discrete movements of the upper limb, especially the movements of hands and fingers. Then comes the premotor cortex or the Brodmann's area 6, which is placed anterior to the primary motor cortex area 4. Unlike the Brodmann's area 4, this area is responsible for controlling complex patterns of movements. And another particular feature of premotor cortex is that it contains multiple mirror neurons. And what are these mirror neurons? These are the special neurons which are responsible for learning new skills. And new skills are learned by the phenomenon of imitation. So that is the reason we label these special neurons as mirror neurons, because they mimic and learn new skills. Another motor area anteriorly placed to the primary motor cortex area 4 is supplementary motor cortex. And supplementary motor cortex along with the premotor cortex, both are labeled according to the Brodmann's classification as area 6. And this area is responsible for usually bilateral movements. So bilateral grasping movements, especially the movements of hands required for climbing, all such bilateral movements are controlled by this supplementary motor area 6. Other functions of this motor cortex is in fixation movements of different segments of the body. Moreover, different body-wide attitudinal movements are controlled, and some of them are responsible for the positional movements of head as well as eyes. So these are the primary functions of supplementary motor area. So we have discussed the three motor cortex areas: primary motor area, area 4, premotor area, and supplementary motor area, area 6. Primary motor area is responsible for controlling discrete voluntary movements, especially the movements of hands and movement of fingers. Whereas the premotor area is responsible for the control of complex pattern of movements, while supplementary motor area is responsible for bilateral grasping movements of hands. Now this figure is taken from your textbook. This is the cytoarchitecture of the cerebral cortex. By cytoarchitecture, we mean the histological layers and all the histological cells which are present within each layer of the cerebrum. And as you can see on the left hand side of this figure, the layers of the cerebral cortex are denoted by capital Roman numerals. From outside to inside, these layers are labeled as layer 1 to layer 6, where the external most layer or the outermost layer is the molecular layer. So layer 1 is the outermost layer, that is molecular layer. Inside the molecular layer is the external granular layer, which is layer 2. So this is the second layer or the external granular layer. The third layer is the layer of pyramidal cells. As you can see, it contains multiple pyramid shaped cells, and this is denoted by the capital Roman number 3. Deep to the internal pyramidal layer is the internal granular layer, followed by the large pyramidal layer, and the innermost layer is the layer of fusiform cells or polymorph cells. So from outside to inside, the cerebrum is divided into 6 cortical layers, where molecular layer is the outermost layer and the layer of fusiform cells or polymorph cells is the innermost layer. In between, there are other layers sandwiched between the molecular and fusiform layer, and these are the granular layer, pyramidal layer, both external granular and internal granular, as well as the fifth layer of large pyramidal cell. So basically, there are 3 types of cells located within the cerebral layers, and these 3 cells are the granular layer, or which contains the granular cell. The other name for granular cell is stellate cell as well. So this layer 2, these are multiple granule shaped cells known as stellate cells or granular cells. The thing to remember is that some of these granular cells are excitatory in nature, whereas others are inhibitory in nature. Those which are excitatory in nature are responsible for the release of excitatory neurotransmitter, that is glutamate. So the important neurotransmitter is glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. However, there are some granular cells which are responsible for the release of an inhibitory neurotransmitter, that is GABA, where GABA or GABA stands for gamma amino butyric acid. So this granular layer, which contains granules or granular cells, is responsible for release of either the excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate or the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA. Besides the granular cells, there are pyramidal cells. As you can see, these are pyramid in shape, and these are sandwiched between the other layers, the pyramidal cells, and the innermost cell is the fusiform cells or the polymorph cells. These are known as polymorph because they exhibit polymorphism. By polymorphism, we mean variation in size as well as variation in shape. So there are three important cells which are present within the cerebral cortex: granular cells, pyramidal cells, and fusiform cells, or the other name is polymorph cells. One thing that you must remember is that the input or the afferent nerve fibers, they enter the layer number 4 first. So layer 4 is the site for input. All the afferent fibers, all the input fibers will enter layer 4 first. So this is the receiving side or the receiving end for the cerebrum. Once the axons, they synapse with the cells present inside the fourth layer, then the axons will either travel upwards or some of them will travel deep towards the polymorph cells. But the site of origin or the input or receiving end is the layer 4. All the afferent fibers, all the axons of the fibers will enter the layer 4 first. Once the input has been received, then the axons will travel upwards as well as downwards. And multiple synapses will be formed by the granular cells and the pyramidal cells. So layer 4 is the layer of input. Layer 5 and layer 6, these are the output layers. Layer 5 and 6 are the output. So input is layer 4 and output layer is layer 5 and layer 6. So you must remember that all the afferent fibers, they will synapse in the cells which are located in the layer 4 first. And then the fibers will ascend either upwards or downwards, where layer 5 and 6 are the layer for the output fibers. Now this is the diagrammatic representation of the previous diagram. Again, you can see we are zooming into the pyramidal layer. You can see the pyramidal cells. These are the pyramidal cells, triangular pyramidal shaped cells present in layer 5. Then you can also observe the stellate cells. Remember, the other name for granular cells is stellate cells. So stellate cells or granular cells, both are the same. And you can see how the synapses are being formed between the stellate cells as well as pyramidal cells. And layer 4 is the layer which is the receiving end or the input. So all the afferent fibers, usually from the thalamus, they will terminate in the layer 4 first, where multiple stellate cells are already there. Now this input will be processed and the signal will be transmitted in either direction, upwards towards the molecular layer as well as downwards deep to the polymorph cells. And layer 5 and 6, these are the output fibers. So to summarize, to conclude, there are 6 layers of the cerebral cortex. Starting from outside to inside, we have the molecular layer, then comes the external granular layer, the pyramidal layer, the internal granular layer, and the innermost layer is the cell layer of fusiform layer or polymorph cells. And the granular cells or the stellate cells, they are responsible for receiving the input via layer 4, and then these axons, they travel either upwards or downwards, and they release either excitatory neurotransmitters, for example glutamate, as well as inhibitory neurotransmitters like gamma aminobutyric acid. So we have discussed the functions of the motor cortex areas, focusing on the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, as well as the supplementary motor cortex. All these areas are present anterior to the central sulcus of Rolando. Similarly, the gyrus posterior or the area of cerebrum posterior to this central sulcus is the sensory cortex, which includes the somatosensory association area and somatosensory primary area, area 312 and area 57. Besides the motor areas and sensory areas, there are some other areas located within the cerebral cortex that are difficult to classify under the category of either motor area or sensory area. That is the reason we can classify these areas as association areas. So they are very difficult to be classified under true motor area or true sensory area. So we are classifying these areas separately as association areas. The first association area is the parieto-occipito-temporal association area, commonly denoted as POT association area, capital POT, POT association area, that is parieto-occipito-temporal association area. As the name indicates, this area is responsible for connecting the 3 lobes of the cerebral cortex: parietal lobe, occipital lobe, as well as temporal lobe. So this is the first of the 3 association areas. The second association area is the prefrontal association area. And this association area is located in the prefrontal gyrus. Prefrontal gyrus is present anterior to the premotor area. As you can see, this is the central sulcus of Rolando. Anterior to is the primary motor area. Anterior to primary motor area is premotor and supplementary motor area. Area 4 and area 6. And anterior to this premotor area is the prefrontal gyrus, in which the prefrontal association area is located. And the third association area is known as the limbic association area. We call it as limbic because it is related to the limbic system. We will discuss the details and the components of the limbic system in the coming lectures, inshallah. So there are 3 association areas: parieto-occipito-temporal association area, located at the junction of these 3 lobes; the prefrontal association area, located within the prefrontal gyrus; and the third one is limbic association area, where some portion of the limbic association area is located in the frontal lobe and some of it is located within the temporal lobe. And we have separately classified these areas as association areas because it's difficult to classify them under the category of true sensory or true motor cortex. Now, what are the functions of these association areas? We will start from the POT association area, that is parieto-occipito-temporal association area. And the major function of this parieto-occipital temporal association areas are depicted in this figure. And the first function is the spatial coordination of body surroundings. So this is an important function of the port association area. This region is involved in spatial coordination and the body surroundings. So all the axes of the body, the three axes X, Y, Z, this region is responsible to coordinate the body according to the spatial axis and the surroundings of the body. So this is one of the functions of port association area. Another important function of this area is the visual processing of words. So this region of port association area is known as the angular gyrus. This is known as angular gyrus. Why it is known as angular gyrus? Because this is the junction at which the three lobes, they are connecting with each other. The visual cortex, the auditory cortex, and the sensory cortex. This is known as the angular gyrus. And this angular gyrus is responsible for visual processing of words, especially during reading. So when you read a word, when you read a sentence, and you interpret the meaning of it, this is the function performed by the angular gyrus, which is one of the portions of the port association area. Another important function of port association area is the naming of objects. So this is the third function. First function is the spatial coordination of body. Second function of port association area is the visual processing of words, which is the region of the angular gyrus. And the third function is the naming of objects. And the fourth function performed by the port association area is the comprehension of language. A very important feature is language comprehension. And this area is known as Wernicke's area. And according to the Brodmann's classification, Wernicke's area has been given the number 22. So Wernicke's area, as you can see, the location is located in the posterior part of superior temporal gyrus. I repeat, Wernicke's area is located in the posterior portion of the superior temporal gyrus. And this area is known as the Brodmann's area 22 or Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is responsible for comprehension of language. So language comprehension, spatial coordination of body, visual processing of words, and naming of objects. These are the four primary functions of the port association area or parieto-occipito-temporal association area. The other association area is the prefrontal association area, and this prefrontal association area is located within the prefrontal gyrus, the gyrus anterior to the prefrontal cortex, or sorry, anterior to the premotor cortex. So this is the region of prefrontal association area. And what are the functions of the prefrontal association area? Planning of complex movements is one of them. So it programs the movements, it plans the movements, and moreover, elaboration of thoughts is another function of the prefrontal association area. So if you remove the prefrontal association area, the procedure is known as prefrontal lobotomy. So what happens if you remove this prefrontal region, the subject will be unable to plan complex movements. So he will not be able to plan his movements. He will not be able to solve complex problems. Moreover, he will be unable to perform parallel tasks. So multitasking will be affected as well. Moreover, elaboration of thoughts will be impaired because this prefrontal association area is responsible for the storage of working memory. And working memory is the short-term memory that we use to perform any activity, any physical activity. So working memory will be impaired. The ability to solve complex problems will be impaired. The ability to perform parallel tasks or multitasking will be impaired as well. Moreover, some of the emotional aspects like sexual feelings as well as emotional feelings will be impaired as well. So these are the signs that you will observe in a patient or in a subject in which the prefrontal lobe has been removed, and the procedure is known as prefrontal lobotomy. So this is the second association area, prefrontal association area. Another function of the prefrontal association area is its role in word formation. And this is the function performed by the Broca's area. And according to the Brodmann's classification, Broca's area has been given number 44 and 45. Remember, for area 44 and area 45 is the Broca's area. Area 22 is the Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is located in the posterior portion of the superior temporal gyrus. Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe. You can see this is the frontal lobe and this is the inferior frontal gyrus. So Broca's area is located in the posterior part of the inferior frontal gyrus, whereas Wernicke's area is located in the posterior portion of the superior temporal gyrus. So the anatomical location of these speech areas, Wernicke's area and Broca's area is very important. So you must remember the precise location. The name of the gyrus should be mentioned when you are mentioning the location of these speech areas. So posterior portion of the inferior frontal gyrus is the site for the Broca's area. And this area is the motor speech area. Wernicke's area is the sensory speech area, which is required for language understanding or language comprehension, where word formation or articulation is done by the motor speech area, area 44, area 45, that is Broca's area. So we can include Broca's area in the prefrontal association cortex, and we can include Wernicke's area in the pot association cortex. The third association area is the limbic association area. And this orange shaded region is the area for the limbic association area. All this region is the site for limbic association area. And you can see most of the anterior temporal lobe is involved, and the inferior anteroinferior part of the frontal lobe is also included within this limbic association area. And this is known as limbic association area because this is concerned with the emotions and behavior of the individual. So it controls the behavior, it controls the emotions and the motivational aspects of the individual. All these functions are performed by the limbic association area. So this figure is very important. We have discussed the three association areas: pot association area, parieto-occipito-temporal association area and the four functions of the pot association area, including the function of vernix area. Then we discussed the prefrontal association area, including the function performed by the Broca's area. And then the third is the limbic association area. Now we will discuss the concept of cerebral dominance. By cerebral dominance, we mean that within each individual, either the left cerebral hemisphere is dominant or the right cerebral hemisphere is dominant. As we all know, the left cerebral hemisphere controls the movement of the right side of the body, and the right cerebral hemisphere controls the movement of the left side of the body. So in 90 to 95% of all individuals, the left cerebral hemisphere is dominant. That is the reason almost 90 to 95% of people, they are right-handed, because right side of the body is controlled by the left cerebral hemisphere. So this is known as the left-sided dominance, or the dominance of left cerebral hemisphere. So in a person in which the left cerebral hemisphere is dominant, obviously he or she is going to be right-handed. If you see the areas within the cerebral hemisphere, all the areas of speech, motor speech area, vernix area, the temporal regions, all these are dominant in the left side. Similarly, if you see the right-sided person, or you can see in a person in which the right cerebral hemisphere is dominant, these are the functions of the right cerebral hemisphere. So perception of music is a function of the right cerebral hemisphere. Stereognosis, again, another function. Recognition of forms and shapes and faces of body images, again a function of the right cerebral hemisphere. Determination of visual input, again the right cerebral hemisphere is dominant. Verbal speech is interpreted by, again, the right cerebral hemisphere. So in 90% of the individuals, the left cerebral hemisphere is dominant. That is the reason 90 to 95% of people are right-handed. And in a person who is right-handed, obviously the areas of speech will be well developed in the left cerebral hemisphere. Especially Broca's speech area will be well developed on the left cerebral hemisphere. The vernix speech area will be well developed in the left cerebral hemisphere, and the temporal region, the angular gyrus, all these areas will be dominant on the left side. Whereas interpretation of music, verbal communication, all these are functions of the right cerebral hemisphere. Now this is the inferior view of the cerebral cortex. You are viewing the inferior surface of the cerebral cortex. This is the right cerebral hemisphere and this is the left cerebral hemisphere. This is the anterior lobe, this is the posterior lobe. Correction, this is the frontal lobe, this is the temporal lobe. And here you can see this red shaded region located over the inferior surface of the parietal lobe as well as the occipital lobe. This is the occipital lobe, the inferior surface of the occipital lobe, as well as some portion of the inferior surface of the parietal lobe. This area of cerebrum located inferiorly is the area for facial recognition. Remember, this area is known as the area of facial recognition. So if there is damage to this area, obviously the person will be unable to recognize faces. And the inability to recognize faces is known as prosopagnosia. Let me spell it correctly. Proso, prosopagnosia. Pagnosia. So prosopagnosia is inability to recognize faces. And this is the clinical condition in a patient or in a subject in which the areas of the inferior occipital surface and the inferior parietal area is damaged. So this is the facial recognition area. So whenever there is damage to this area, the person, he or she, will not be able to recognize faces. And the clinical term that we use is prosopagnosia. Remember, in some books in the 11th edition of Guyton, it was written prosophenosia. So prosophenosia or prosopagnosia, both are the same. But the preferred terminology is prosopagnosia. The former term was prosophenosia, but the new term is prosopagnosia. In simple words, inability to recognize faces is prosopagnosia. Now we will discuss yet another important clinical condition known as aphasia. Aphasia, in simple words, means difficulty in speech, and we can spell it as APHASIA. Aphasia, difficulty in speech. Remember, this aphasia is different from dysarthria. Whenever there is difficulty in speech due to damage to any of the regions of the speech areas located within the cerebrum, the clinical condition will be labeled as aphasia. Whereas dysarthria is difficulty in speaking due to abnormality in the mouth or larynx. So before going to discuss the types of aphasia, we will discuss the location of important speech areas. And one of them is the vernix area. As we have discussed earlier, according to the Brodmann's classification, vernix area has been given the number 22. And this blue region is the vernix area, and this is located in the posterior part of superior temporal gyrus. This is located in the posterior portion of the superior temporal gyrus. The other speech area is known as the Broca's speech area, or area 44 and 45. According to Brodmann's classification, area 44, 45 is the Broca's speech area. Remember, vernix speech area is also known as the sensory speech area. Broca's speech area is also known as the motor speech area. So if there is damage to the vernix area, this will result in vernix aphasia. Similarly, if there is lesion or damage to the Broca's or motor speech area, this will result in motor aphasia or Broca's aphasia. As far as the vernix area is concerned, this is the area where multiple inputs are received. And the three important input fibers are, number one, the visual input fibers coming from the visual cortex, the auditory input fibers coming from the auditory cortex, and the third one is the somatic input fibers coming from the somatosensory area. So three types of input fibers are received and interpreted: auditory, visual, and somatic. So these three input fibers, they will terminate at the sensory speech area, and this will be comprehended and interpreted within this area 22. We call it as sensory speech area because this is the area responsible for understanding of speech or comprehension of speech. So language understanding, language comprehension, this is the primary function of Wernicke's area. Whereas the Broca's speech area, which is located anterior to the Wernicke's speech area in the inferior frontal gyrus, this is responsible for the articulation of words or formation of words. That is why we call it as the motor speech area. Remember, the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area, both are connected with the help of a fasciculus known as the arcuate fascicle. Arcuate fascicle is the bundle which connects the Wernicke's area with the motor speech area, Broca's area. So on the left hand side is the depiction of the pathway when you speak a heard word. So speaking a heard word involves a different pathway, number one. Speaking a written word involves a different pathway, number two. So let's focus on the figure given on the left side first. So when you speak a heard word, obviously the input is received by the auditory area located within the temporal lobe. So the primary auditory area or the primary auditory cortex will receive the auditory stimulus first. So impulse transmission will start from primary auditory area. Then the signal will be sent backwards towards the Wernicke's area in the in the superior temporal gyrus located posteriorly. So this is the second relay station. So input will be received by the primary auditory cortex. Then this will be sent backwards toward the posterior part of superior temporal gyrus, that is Wernicke's area. As we have discussed, the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area, they are connected with the help of a fasciculus known as arcuate fascicle. And this signal from the Wernicke's area will be sent back towards the frontal lobe where the Broca's area is located. So this is the third relay station. And this is the site for the motor speech area or the Broca's area. And signal will be transmitted via arcuate fasciculus. And from Broca's speech area, the impulse will be processed further towards the motor cortex. And this is the final destination, the final relay station, the motor cortex. So when you speak a heard word, the input is received by the primary auditory area, number one. Then this signal is sent backwards towards the Wernicke's area, the sensory speech area. This sensory speech area is connected with the motor speech area with the help of arcuate fasciculus. So signal will be received by the Broca's motor speech area. And then the final destination is the motor cortex where impulse will be transmitted. Now, if we compare speaking a heard word with speaking a written word, obviously the pathway is different. And the first area which is involved is the primary visual cortex, from where the input is received. From the primary visual cortex, the signal will be transmitted to the angular gyrus. Remember, this shaded circle region is known as the angular gyrus. It is called as angular gyrus because it is present at an angle connecting the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes together. And this is the region, the angular gyrus, where signal will be received and then processed further to the vernix area, which is the sensory speech area. Rest of the pathway is the same. From vernix area via the arcuate fascicle, the signal will be transmitted to the Broca speech area and then towards the motor cortex. So we will resume our discussion on aphasia from here tomorrow, inshallah. We will discuss the different types of aphasia, vernix aphasia, Broca's aphasia, global aphasia. Inshallah, we will continue from here tomorrow. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.